Hi everyone, today's lecture is on Judaism and the origins of Christianity. Most of today's lecture will focus on the patriarchs of Judaism, that's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or Israel. Obviously these aren't real pictures of them because they lived thousands of years ago, and nobody knows what they looked like, but it's just an artist's rendering, and that's kind of the case for most of these pictures. It's kind of annoying because a lot of the times biblical figures are depicted as being very white when really they would have been what we consider today to be people of color. So just kind of keep that in mind that this is totally made up. This is not what they looked like. So the patriarchs are the biological and intellectual ancestors of modern Judaism. The patriarchs themselves were not Jews, since Judaism was not a real concept until hundreds of years after their deaths. The stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob serve as Jewish creation myths. So I'm going to recount that creation myth here, but I want you to keep in mind that these stories were not recorded until the 6th century BCE during the Babylonian captivity. So even though these characters purportedly lived around 1800 BCE, as I mark here on the timeline, that's when the Jews believe their lineage begins, but we have no documentation of Judaism until more than 1,000 years after that. And that is around the time that the Torah is written, as you can see here, around 600 BCE. So Abraham was born in the city of Ur in Babylonia in 1800 BCE. So we've talked about Ur before. It was one of those first cities in Mesopotamia. His father was a run-of-the-mill idol merchant. So basically he sold figurines of various deities or idols that were worshipped by the locals. But Abraham was a pretty philosophical fellow, and he spent a lot of time contemplating divinity. He eventually came to conceive of the universe as the creation of one single creator. Well, this was really new at the time. Up to this point, polytheism had been the order of the day. So think of the Mesopotamians, the Olmecs, Harappans, Vedic Hindus. They're all polytheistic. So the idea that there was a single deity, a single creator of everyone and everything, was something that was quite new. It must have sounded absolutely bonkers to Abraham's peers. They were, this is just some kind of brand new, it must have seemed like a gimmick, I would guess. And one day, Abraham smashed all the idols in his father's shop. When his father discovered what he'd done, he was angry. But Abraham told him, the idols got into a fight and the big one smashed all the other ones. His father said, don't be ridiculous. These idols have no life or power. They can't do anything. And Abraham replied, then why do you worship them? I know you're all thinking, sick burn, Abraham. But yeah, so this is kind of how Abraham went about trying to convert his father. Eventually, Abraham's one and only God came to earth and told Abraham that if he left his family and his home, God would bless him with a great nation. Abraham agreed. This agreement became known as the covenant between God and the Jewish people. The covenant involved obligations on both sides. The obligations of the Jews to God were made more explicit over time, and these became the rules of Judaism as laid down in the Torah. Abraham was subjected to 10 tests of faith, and one of these was giving up his home and adopting a nomadic lifestyle. Abraham traveled around what is now the Near East. He and his wife Sarah spent their lives moving from one place to another. At one point, Sarah, who was elderly, asked Abraham to have a child with a maidservant named Hagar because she was unable to have children at that point. She was past childbearing years. He did, and the child's name was Ishmael. Ishmael is said to be the ancestor of the Arabs, and this here is a depiction of Hagar and Ishmael. When Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90 years old, God blessed them with a miracle child. This child's name was Isaac, and Isaac is known as ancestor to all Jews. The 10th test of faith that God gave to Abraham was to sacrifice his only child, Isaac. Both Abraham and Isaac agreed to these terms, and Abraham began the ceremony to sacrifice his son to God. But at the moment before Isaac was sacrificed, an angel came down and stopped Abraham from killing his son. And this story is used by Jews as evidence that their God dislikes human sacrifice, which is a common ceremony in many religions at the time. So Isaac lived, and he grew up and married the love of his life, Rebekah, and had twin sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau were rivals, and as you can see here in this depiction, Esau was favored by Isaac, and Jacob was favored by Rebekah. At some point, Jacob eloped and took 4 wives, Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah, and he had 12 children between them. And you can see in this sort of family tree, and there was also sort of a random girl named Dinah, and she was there's a book about her called The Red Tent. It's kind of interesting. It's a fictionalized account. So Jacob is just sort of living his life with his 4 wives and, a zillion kids, and they live a nomadic lifestyle, like kind of living in and out of tents. But at some point, he goes out at night and he wrestles with an angel, and he's given the name Israel, which meant wrestles with God. Jacob's 12 children then become known as the 12 tribes of Israel. Over centuries, these 12 tribes were enslaved by the Egyptians, only to be led out by Moses. And that is when, Moses kind of leads all the Jews on a pilgrimage, and he parts the Red Sea. This is kind of a very common story. At the end of their journey in the desert, they were gifted the Torah. So though Judaism grew slowly as generations of people procreated, they remained persecuted minorities in the ancient world. This was the status of Jews when around 4 BCE, Jesus of Nazareth was born. Jesus was a Jew, and scholars are confident that he existed, but the details of his life are hotly debated by historians. And I have here an image of what Jesus probably looked something like this. At this point, I'm going to pause for 1 second to let you all know that I have a engagement directive. Send me an email telling me your favorite color so that I know you watched this video. And my email is marissac@buffalo.edu. marissac@buffalo.edu. Much like the life of the Buddha disrupted Hinduism, the life of Jesus of Nazareth was incredibly disruptive to the ancient Near East, which, at this point, was ruled by Rome. The Jews had always been problematic for rulers in the ancient world because their covenant with God was perceived to be in conflict with being a loyal subject. Jesus was no exception to this. In fact, he and his followers were even more problematic because as early Christianity developed, it became clear that this faith was more evangelical and inclusive than the Jews. This made it appealing to Jews and non-Jews alike, so this made it faster spreading and therefore more threatening. Jesus of Nazareth's followers also tended to come from more subversive sects of society, former sinners and enemies of the Roman Empire. I'm going to stop the story here because we've entered the Common Era, and I haven't yet covered Rome, which is extremely important to the rest of the story. But I want you to think about how humans' relationship to the divine varied across time and space. This is the last submodule of this Interior Worlds module. Now, I want to know, do you see any trends?